because when you sit in the fire, you burn out everything that isn't the dross. You refine yourself and everything. And that's what we're doing by sitting in the fire. That's why it may not be comfortable, but it is important. It's important work, and we're going to make it through this. The restorative circles, we've created an interactive, not panel, not talking heads. We're not doing that. And so we're encouraging, and we're going to do more of circles where everybody is participating together. One of our, the Racial Justice Collaborative is putting this on. And one of our principles is that every voice must be heard. So as we put that out as a principle, we're also aware as these voices that must be heard to the extent possible to govern yourself. Say what you need to say, but say it in a way that can be heard or felt. So the agenda for today, here we are, we're in the welcome, the guided meditation. Pretty soon we're going to do the introduction. We've got a large group process coming up. Now watch that process carefully, all participants, because we are modeling what you're going to do in your small group. Exactly the same thing. We're going to be working with a set of questions. You're going to have the same questions. So this modeling is for you. So then we have a half an hour lunch. We're all at home. It doesn't take long to eat. Then Crystal is going to come on. She's a member of the collaborative. She's going to come on and give us some direction, some understanding of a tool, an action tool that she has adapted that's going to help us create an action plan for ourselves. Then we go to the second small group meeting where we're going to do what Crystal just talked about. Then we reconvene in the large group. When we reconvene in the large group, we have a survey that somehow will magically appear for people. So we're asking everybody, maybe it'll be in the chat. I don't know how, Heather will handle that. But we're asking you, before you leave, fill out the survey so that we can be guided on our next steps. This is a step, but we've got more steps to take. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, here we are. We did the norms. Anti-Blackness. That's the crux of what we're doing today. Anti-Blackness, how does it manifest? And I'm going to call on Pharaoh to go through this next set of how anti-Blackness manifests.
Thank you. So before we go into the more group-based circle aspects, it's really important that we have a strong foundation for understanding of core concepts so that we can make the best out of the time that we have for those group discussions. So in order to get onto some of the later terms, it's important to define something that's a very commonly reoccurring concept in a lot of these conversations, which is the concept of white supremacy, which, as you can see here, is defined as a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and people of color by white peoples in the nations of the European continent and their cultural successors, which is to say, such as countries as the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege.
Okay.
So, another term, which is highly related, but is important to define separately, is the concept of Eurocentric racism, hereby defined specifically and identified specifically as Eurocentric racism, the marginalization and oppression of Black and other people of color based on socially constructed racial hierarchy that privileges white people. So this specific format that we're seeing here, you can see is specifically directed from the European context. It is one of the most common concepts, I'd say is most dominant concept of this field in any Western nation, and a majority of countries that were heavily influenced and still directly or indirectly influenced by Western powers. This is usually the underlying concept that is behind a lot of these more subversive concepts.
Next.
So, institutional racism is important to define because there is a difference of scale and also reaching influence when you're describing institutional racism versus interpersonal racism. A lot of the time, institutional racism is much harder to see in addition to that, because interpersonal racism is generally much more blatant and can often be much more visibly offensive to one's personage. And so that's usually making it more visible. But institutional racism, as we can see here, is defined as social, economic, legal, political, and other systems and institutions that perpetuate racial inequalities, including access to housing, schooling, accumulated wealth, high-paying jobs, etc. So those things are all greatly important, but because the aspects of the inequality around those things in racial circles is baked into the framework of those institutions, it is oftentimes a lot harder to see.
Next.
So now we get to anti-Black racism specifically, a specific kind of racism directed towards Black people. Anti-Blackness devalues Blackness and dehumanizes Black people. The first form of anti-Blackness is overt racism. The second form of anti-Blackness is unethical disregard for Black people, as seen in the cases of police or civilian brutality against Black bodies. So it's important to define anti-Black racism here. So we're going to be talking about how this is set apart from various other concepts. As we had previously defined Eurocentric racism as being forms of racism against people of color. And it is important to note how there are shared experiences in racism between peoples of color, but it's important to not let that be confused with thinking that all forms of racism are uniform between all minorities, because that isn't the case. There are important differences in how those things can manifest, and if we blind ourselves to those things for the point of oversimplification or generalization, then it makes it so that we aren't equipped with the knowledge or the tools necessary to appropriately tackle those issues. So here we're defining specifically anti-Black racism in this definition and context.
Next.
Internalized anti-Blackness. So as you can see here, just as there's a system in place that reinforces the power and expands the privilege of white people, there's a system in place that actively discourages and undermines the power and self-worth of Black people and mires them in their own oppression. So this is a very important part of anti-Blackness, and it's often a way in which Black people subconsciously take in various effects of the systems of institutionalized racism around them, and then we can often perpetuate those things internally. Oftentimes, I would say most of the time, it is completely unintentional, and it is often different aspects of inferiority and sense of inferiority around your race and features around your race that then in turn are projected onto your children and so on until it becomes intergenerational issues that become in certain manners institutions of their own within the own internal community.
Next.
Lived internalized anti-Blackness. So this is sort of describing the process and the system of how internalized anti-Blackness manifests on a both individual basis and also on the institutional basis that I had described. So we have Black individuals and the community are repeatedly victimized by racism. This can be both in overt ways and in subversive ways. Racist ideas are believed, taken inside, internalized. And then ideas, beliefs, actions, and behaviors develop that support and collude with racism. More than just a minor consequence of racism internalized, racism is a clandestine oppression and reaction to racism that has a life of its own. So as I was saying, these things aren't always as blatant as someone might think. These things can manifest in aspects as subtle as being bombarded with, frequent depictions and beauty campaigns that show that beautiful hair is straight hair. And so it might not immediately come off as something blatantly bigoted, but over time, the more you present one aspect, which is very rarely found naturally in Black people, as being beautiful, the converse of that becomes true, which is eventually it'll be internalized that Black features, whether that be, naturally kinky hair or wider nose or darker skin tone or thicker lips, eventually get shifted more and more towards being seen as ugly, even though it's not inherently said all the time, because the adverse is always presented as the opposite. Logic naturally forces you to put yourself in that box. And then when you're placed in that situation and that situation gets passed down to your children, that is how these systems are perpetuated through entire generations and become so normalized in society. The ultimate result of internalized oppression. It's not the world that was my oppressor, because what the world does to you, if the world does it to you for long enough and effectively enough, you begin to do it to yourself. James Baldwin. And that is a quote from a how this process worms its way into you like a parasite until it becomes indistinguishable. And at that point, you are just as much a part of putting yourself down as the systems around you are in gearing you towards that final outcome.
Next. Thank you, Farrell. And so now I'm going to talk here and introduce the body of what we're going to do. And as I've looked at how to present this information, something happened that really struck me. And I did some research and I found that in 1944, I always thought about it as the 1964 Civil Rights Act that talked about hearts and minds and how hard they are to change. But in 1944, America was beginning to emphasize this focus on hearts and minds to end what it perceived as its racial problems. And this prioritized education and moral persuasion. It's the right thing to do. We heard this for a long time, even to business, until we started to realize that it's the economically prudent thing to do. But we looked at it, it's the right thing to do, and that moved almost nobody. So this approach was attractive to many white Americans. Why? Because it allowed them to condemn individual prejudice, and they didn't have to give up their privileged access to better jobs, better housing, better schools. And I don't have to say to any one of you to convince you of this, because we all know this is true. So Heather, next. And at the same time, this is what struck me so importantly, at the same time that America, white America, was stressing hearts and minds, here is what the Negro wants. In 1944, the Negro wants first-class citizenship, equality of opportunity, equal pay. It doesn't mention your hearts and minds. Equal protection of the laws, equality of suffrage, equal recognition of the dignity of the human being, and abolition of public segregation. Now, some of this has moved and shifted. We don't have to sit in the back of the bus, but we're segregated fully. And a huge, big problem that we have is our physical segregation. We live in different places, and so we don't know each other easily. So we have to come to things like this to figure it out. Heather, next. Here we are today. That was 1944. The world is now grasping and grappling with racism and anti-Blackness. And it's so strong, and because of technology, and because Black people keep not getting killed, they're being murdered on our streets by our officers of the law. They represent us. They are us murdering Black people on the street. Next. So now, okay, what can we do? How do we rectify this anti-Blackness? First, we must understand and identify the ways it manifests. Now, I talked about some of those. We're going to talk about more. Next. First, something we all feel and understand, interpersonal manifestations. Now, how do you begin to look at that? Just ask yourself, where do I live? Who are my friends? Who do my children play with? Next. And then we go to other manifestations. You hear Black people speak in your meetings, and you can see the ideas. If you watch, you'll see that the ideas are dismissed. You're expecting Black criminality when you. It's built into us. You know, it's what we understand, what we've learned. When we hear the TV start to talk about something happened to somebody, and we kind of tune in, and we're expecting certain kinds of behavior to be Black criminality. We doubt Black intelligence. We don't want to, if we're at work, we don't want to work with the Black coworker because we want to get rewarded. We want a good job, and we don't think that person is intelligent. We go to places, to the theater, wherever we go, and we see people, maybe they're dressed up, and we say, oh, that must be a servant. This doesn't come into your mind. See, that's the thing about anti-Black racism, or especially anti-Black racism. You don't have to think about it and say it to yourself and then carry it out. It's an automatic. You see somebody, you hand them your glass. You treat, well, Black people are treated suspiciously. And that's this whole following you around, and even myself. And I'm not a young woman, but I'm aware when I go into a store, there are certain things that I do, even today. So I'm not going to go walk close to the door where it looks like with anything in my hands, because somebody might think I'm getting ready to run out the door. So there are just all of these things that you do, that you've accommodated to live in this society. And if it's for me, and I'm as old as most of you out here, and older than most, if it happens for me, what is it like for a person Pharaoh's age, a young Black man? What about, and how many times can this happen where we internalize it, but we also resent it? We resent it, treated, expecting our work to be inferior, just treated rudely and disrespectfully. So those are the interpersonal things. But if you really want to look at yourself, where do you live? Who do your kids play with? Where do they go to school? What is that like? Because people, they want what they consider best. And this what you have is what you consider the best that you can do. Next. Now, okay, the institutional manifestations. Next. Our school systems, our employment discrimination, our housing, voting, the criminal justice system, the access to health care that we're all hearing about as we look at essential workers, and we see who they are, and they don't have health insurance. And why is that? That's a whole different question. Food deserts, the racial wealth gap. Now, Heather, I don't know if can you look back at the 1944, what does the Negro want slide? Can you bring that up? So put that in your mind, what it is that, okay, here it is. This is what struck me. Here we are in 2020, and we're looking at healthcare, and we're looking at the wealth gap, and we're looking at schools, and we're looking at all the same things that we said that we want first-class citizenship. And it is still just a mirage. It's a mirage because it seems like everybody can see it. But for Black people, it's not our lives, it's not our lived experience. So Heather, can you take it back to the next after that next? And now, okay, now here we are. We have to do both. In 1944, we had white America wanted to look at the hearts and minds, and Black America wanted freedom. They wanted we wanted first class citizenship. So now what do we have to do in 2020 when things are really escalating? We have to do both. We have to clean up the hearts and minds, and we have to work passionately. And why do we have to still clean up the hearts and minds? Because look at the whole George Floyd murder. George Floyd murder. I live in Somerville, and I'm on Fresh Pond a lot. I saw white people on Fresh Pond with signs that said Black Lives Matters, and they kept that up for a long time. And I saw white people all over the world where no Black people lived. And what's happening now? It is receding. We're going back to normal. And what is normal? Our normal is anti-Black racism, because nothing has changed inside of us. We can't sustain an external reality that does not match with who we are on the inside. We have to be willing to do whatever it takes. And that's what we're going to do, starting today, if we're not already doing it. Next. And we have to do this continually. So here is looking at external, the externally institutional. Look at each structure, housing, employment, education, and look at it individually. How is anti-Blackness exhibited in each system? Then ask yourself, what are you doing to actively disrupt? Next. Now remember, continuously disrupt. As you're looking, are Black people being hired, paid, promoted comparably? If not, how can you advocate for change? Now we're talking about action steps. And when you get to the action planning, pull up this slide and think about it. Who are the policymakers in your organization? Next. Now, continuously disrupt, use your power and privilege to push for change. Where do you spend your money? Disrupt anti-Blackness. Support small and large Black-owned businesses. Also, Black creatives through PayPal, Venmo, and their Patreon pages. Next, continuously disrupt anti-Blackness. Put your money toward organizations that are anti-racist. And most importantly, as I think about that, look at your networks. How do people get hired? Word of mouth. All the good things, whether it's rentals, everything, jobs, opportunity, we send it out to our people on our networks first before it hits the public. Share your networks and your connections. Look for Black job seekers on LinkedIn and use your access, your privilege. Open up your networks to Black job seekers. Big one. Pharaoh, can you address this?
Yes, so it's important to teach your children to be anti-racist, and there's a lot of ways you can do that. So representation and perception of image is one of the most massive ways that you can go about teaching this. If you can have people presented, if you can have minorities, if you can have Black people presented in different ways that are less conducive to colluding with these issues that we're describing, with all of these aspects of anti-Blackness that are so often rooted in these images, then that's an important way to take that away. And sometimes it doesn't even just mean blatant negative stereotypes. Sometimes it means putting him in more actively not just simply actively positive, but sometimes prestigious roles, and not just prestigious roles in reality, but that could even be in media and in fiction. That can be in movies, TVs, books. So something that in my personal circle we had mentioned about the representation of Black people in movies is sometimes we don't want another hopeful slave movie. Sometimes we want a movie about Black kings. Sometimes we want books about African mythology. Even if stories about the triangle trade and the enslavement of Black people can be very powerful, if you that's all the media that you put out there, then that still gets associated purely with Black people, and that will still be one of the first things you think of, and that's still how those concepts get baked into these institutional, intergenerational aspects of thinking about an entire group of people. So not just books about trauma and pain. Have your children read about Mansa Musa, the history of ancient Nubia, the Asante Empire, books like The Aristocrat Baby. The book is anti-racist and not my idea. A book about whiteness should be mandatory reading for children both at school and at home. And as difficult as these things are attempted to be made by those that would see these institutions continue, it's an important fight to fight. Make sure that you
Okay.
Let's stay with our program because we're going to do that. So Pharaoh, can you start the self-identify, and then everybody will identify themselves. And go ahead, Pharaoh.
Sure, that's always an important part of everything that we do through this collective, is that we like to make clear our personal identification on aspects of race, ethnicity, identity, and other important aspects like that. So my name is Pharaoh Saunders, and I identify as a Black man.
Okay, so now ask, okay, Jordana.
And what are your pronouns, Pharaoh?
He, him.
Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Jordana Hart. I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm Canadian, and my pronouns, as you can see, are she and her.
Nancy?
Good morning. I'm Nancy Rogine. I'm a white woman of midlife, and I live in Portland, Oregon.
I'm just going across my screen, so.
My pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. Reggie?
Hi everyone, my name's Raggy. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in London, and I identify as a queer South Asian woman.
Tina?
Hi everyone, my name is Tina Cabral. I identify as she and her, and I'm a Black woman from Somerville, Massachusetts, of Cape Verdean ancestry.
Mina?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mina Kim. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Korean American, and for the purposes of this conversation today, I also want to identify as East Asian.
Crystal?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Chandler. My pronouns are she and her as well. I identify both as a Black woman and as a Barbadian American. My family's from Barbados. And yeah, I also fall on the queer pansexual spectrum as well, like my friend Raggy. And I'm excited for you guys to be here.
Well, great. And I am Diane Wong, along with Pharaoh Saunders. We are facilitating this segment. I am a Black woman of a multiracial lineage, and she, her. I'm just getting used to that. I mean, I'm out of the generation, so, but I see it's important, she, her. So let's just, everybody, just take a deep breath in before we start. Even if you're off camera, take a deep breath in and exhale. Relax, relax, relax. So as we're getting ready to start, before we start, become aware of what's going on inside of you. Did that breath relax you enough? If not, can you relax more? How are, what was said, where we are so far, just how is that all falling inside of you? And just become aware of what's going on inside. So we've got a couple of questions we're going to grapple with today. And for all of the participants who aren't participating in this panel, remember this group is exactly what you're going to find yourself in short order. And so, and you're going to grapple with the exact same questions. So look at this and feel into what's going on here. So the first question, and I'm just going to throw it out to the group. Also, as a facilitator, I'm going to be comfortable calling on people. I want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to participate. The first question, for you, what is anti-Blackness? What does it mean to you? Mina, you stepped forward, so
Yeah.
what does it mean to you?
So I go back and forth on this to a certain degree, because I think at the heart of it, it's really simple, and that it's having negative thoughts, feelings, and beliefs, and also actions against Black people. Also, having the same negative emotions and responses to the color Black and to darkness. And something that I've been thinking about is how, you know, like that is for me the core of anti-Blackness, but I also think there's this other element and the other aspects that feed into sustaining and supporting anti-Blackness, which has to do with sort of, you know, awareness and knowledge and curiosity of Black folks and Black cultures. And also knowing your own culture as a way to see how your racial identity, but then also ethnic identity has played into perhaps, you know, supporting some of those systemic structures of anti-Blackness.
And Crystal, I saw you shaking your head, so
yeah, I definitely, I was actually writing some notes down because Mina, you touched upon a lot of what I was going to say as well. But to add to what Mina was saying, I think it's also like the unconscious bias as well. That's really part of the anti-Blackness. You know, it's that the things that we don't think about because they've been ingrained and programmed into our minds. So we also think that they're the norm, right? Even though they do hold these anti-Black sentiments and perpetuate the cycles. And then the other thing that I wanted to just touch upon really quick is that I always think about, well, two things I want to touch upon really quickly. That code switching, that's something that has been, especially for people of color, especially Black people, that we have to conform ourselves based on the spaces that we're in, right? And that, you know, our white counterparts don't necessarily have to do that or don't actually have to be conscious and aware of it as a survival technique. So yeah, what Mina said plus that is how I definitely define anti-Blackness.
Jordana, what about you?
So I'm about, if we're going to speak personally, I'm about more than 40 years into my journey. When I think about anti-Blackness, as a white person and a Jewish person, I think about white supremacy. So every morning I wake up and I say to myself, I think of the people I love, the Black people I love, and how they're going to be hurt that day in many ways, microaggressions, their intelligence being questioned. I also think about what's going to happen to me that day, the things that aren't going to happen to me, and the benefits I'm going to get. So this is every day of my life. And I think about how I'm going to fight it. And we can talk about it in the smaller groups, but those are the ways I look at it. And I look at realistic things. I'm going into a restaurant with my Black girlfriends, and I'm already expecting that they're going to somehow be disrespected. And what is my role in dealing with that? I'm not a white savior, but I also have a privileged position. And this is something I've dealt with over many years with my Black girlfriends. I'm thinking about in real estate, you know, I went to look for an apartment and the white real estate lady was really steering me away from where I wanted to live, presuming in our white silent club that I didn't want to live where I told her I wanted to live. And that's the flip side of steering Black people and people of color from what are white neighborhoods. And Diane, you said it, we're fully segregated. And this is one reason. So I pushed back on her. I also filed a complaint against her. And so anyway, those are just examples of things that I think about every day from when I wake up as a white person.
And so Jordana has kind of moved us, transitioned us. So let's do both questions. As you speak, let's also talk about how does anti-Blackness come up within and around you? How does it come up? And then the other part of that question, how have you personally, because we're modeling, how have you personally internalized anti-Blackness?
I can start if you guys want. I think for me, the way it's really shown up in a way that I think is tangible and that people can understand is hair. And just the ways in which Black women, and myself specifically, have had to, you know, tame our hair and manipulate it so that, you know, we are not perceived as threatening or too Black, right, in certain spaces. And it's only now, I'm 27, it's only now, honestly, you know, within recent years that I'm actually learning to, what to do with my natural hair, right? Because from birth, I'm taught that it needs to be, you know, put in extensions, weaves, you know, things like that, needs to be straightened and permed. And so for me, it's, it shows up in like my hair, you know, and that's such a, it seems, you know, basic for some folks, but I think what's important is that, you know, I was taught when I go into interviews, right, like not to wear my natural hair, not to wear natural hairstyles, you know, have a weave, maybe a nice curly weave, or, you know, straight hair, right? So really conforming to the ideas of whiteness, and that whiteness is acceptable, and that if you conform to whiteness, you will get jobs, and if you conform to whiteness, then you will succeed. But I think on the flip side of that is realizing that no matter how much you conform, you don't actually gain the access if you're conforming, you know what I mean? Like you kind of have to go into these spaces like as your authentic self. And so it's, for me, learning my authentic self, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Reggie.
Then I want to come in and slightly slow it down, because you know it's just bang bang bang, and I guess for me it's really horrible, it's really shocking, it's really painful, right? And I want to give a little bit of space for that, because for me anti-Blackness is just hatred, right? And the racism that I've experienced my whole life, particularly when I was a kid, right, it was a daily occurrence that somebody would be chasing me or doing something like that, or trying to hurt me, because that's what it was like in London in those days for kids, right? What I've experienced and the impact that's had on me, it's like times it by 3 at least, right? You know, and our histories, our colonialism, you know, everything we've experienced, which is horrific. When I think about anti-Blackness, I just need to multiply it. And I think it's been more of a recent realization for me. You know, I was very much stuck in my victim place about, oh, I've been through all of these horrific experiences of racism, and stuck in the healing of that. And I think, I feel shy to say it, right? But I'm saying it because there'll be so many in this room that will feel the same. I think post George Floyd, I had a massive wake up call, right? Even though I'd seen so many people murdered before and with such impunity, yeah, I had a massive wake up call. And I realized that, you know, I don't go to the tube and feel scared that somebody's gonna hurt me. I'm not scared for my nephew in the street. I'm a barrister, I'm a human rights barrister, right? Last week, right, a young barrister, a young Black barrister, right, all suited and booted, going to court with a posh little bag like we wear as, like we carry as barristers, right? You know, she was like in her 20s, right, just qualified, right? She got stopped and searched on the way to court. I mean, it's just a joke. You know, you can't, there's just, it doesn't matter what you do, there's always that moment, and you don't know where it's going to come, where someone's going to smack you in the face and try and humiliate you. So for me, anti-Blackness is just pure hatred. And, you know, what's coming across the world, so much of it is aimed particularly at the Black community, which makes me so angry, right? And so much of, you know, like in my communities, there's so much colorism, and billions are spent on skin lightening colors, because the darker you look, the more problematic it is. We all need to look like we're white. And if we're in medium in the brown, we want to try and look a little bit more white. So for me, it's just a horrific, repetitive, it's just repetitive hate. And I won't stand for it anymore. And I'll stand up with you, alongside you, and fight with you.
That's huge. Yeah, I was thinking a lot of those same things. Colorism isn't something unique to anti-Blackness, but it's something that's common in a lot of spheres of racism, but it's massively important within the concept of anti-Blackness, you know, being told not to spend too much time in the sun, you know, during the summertime to avoid getting darker and things like that. And it all bleeds into similar places. One of the aspects of anti-Blackness that I think about the most and have thought about the most as of the last few years is, you know, my biggest things are like history and theology. So one in particular that has always struck me as particularly twisted is how things, specifically like voodoo, is seen as evil, not just by white people, but by even Black people, and how Black people have been literally tricked and deceived into thinking that their own culture and their native religion is evil, is literally satanic, just because of confusion and difference between theological backing. And it's baffled me that people would be so scared of something that is from their own history and their own culture that they can't even talk about it. It'll literally take their breath away because they're so thoroughly deceived into seeing it as an evil thing. And that's one of the examples, and it's a large example of these sorts of concepts of being taken and having aspects of your culture and your identity and your history being changed and altered into something that is seen as evil. And so you then see yourself and your history and where you come from as evil.
For me, you guys are touching upon all points that I was going to say, but just briefly, as Diane mentioned in the beginning, we have to get into the space of love. And for me, anti-Blackness is the opposite of that. It's fear, it's deception, it's all the negative notions and connotations and pain and suffering. And we are all sitting in the fire because of that. Black, white, Asian, whatever your background is, we're all perpetuating that system, whether we're consciously aware of it or not. And Crystal, I remember a saying you made in one of our meetings is, yeah, we know all lives matter, but if we don't address the Black lives right now, you know, then we're all doomed, essentially. We're all doomed. And these are the crossroads right now. And just one story about internalization of Blackness for me, or anti-Blackness, is I remember I was in college and I was thinking of joining a particular sorority. And I won't name any in particular, but there was one where there were more darker hued Black women, and there was one where there's more lighter skinned hued Black women. And so everybody was my friends were encouraging me to go towards more the lighter skinned, but they didn't have that sort of kind of the notions or standing up for what I really wanted, but everybody was drawing me towards that. And I eventually didn't pledge any because of that. But it not only marginalizes us against society at a large, but it also keeps us away from each other. It's a division. So it's like, okay, what is this about now? And so I always regretted not standing up for what I believe in and not going inward and being who I am. And that's another thing. It takes us away from who we are, our heritage, our family, who we really want to be. And then we internalize all of these negative emotions, you know, seen as criminals. Then we think of ourselves as criminals. And I also experienced the feeling of being in a store and, somebody's watching you because they think you might walk out with something. It breaks you. It's traumatic. It's painful. And so we're all in this healing and moving forward from this. It's painful. It's traumatic.
Nancy.
Yeah.
Nancy.
I want to say, you for slowing things down a little, but to me, anti-Black racism is a kind of a pervasive, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious belief system in white superiority. So it's a polarity. They're linked white invaders from Europe that came into an indigenous culture and totally believed that their civilization and their cultures were far superior, and that actually white people from Europe are the definition of human being. And so ever since our country was founded, we've been swimming view at the very bottom. So of the pain and the torture and the lynchings and the demonization, any book you read, almost any book you read from European writing over the centuries puts Black people at the bottom, like has been as uncivilized, barbaric.
So Nancy, Nancy, you're really
that's the
fading.
worldview that we live in.
Nancy, can you hear me? You're going in and out. So you probably need to reboot your connection.
Okay.
So while Nancy is doing that, so what we've been talking about, we brought up anti-Blackness as hatred and anti-Blackness as
Okay. I will.
pushing you away from your culture, and just all the ways that we adapt to anti-Blackness. But now let's go deeper, because if we also have this let's talk about our own perpetuation of anti-Blackness. And so just find that, because that's the harder thing. That's what we're going to ask participants to do, because for me, if I can't find it, then I can address it. So when does it pop up? I mean, how does it pop up in your mind and you see it and you feel an anti-Blackness within you? And then, Reggie?
It feels kind of edgy, right?
It's totally edgy. I guarantee you it's edgy, right?
Yeah, but it's super important, yeah. And I've been on this journey for a while of I know almost everyone in this room gets racist thoughts, right? And the reason, and they shove it down, they pretend they don't, and they shove it down, right? And the reason I know that is because I get them myself, yeah? And so I live in an area of South London where there's a large Black community. And I think it's just all the messages I've received always in my life that I've just looked down and my cat's walked in, who's black and white and perfectly happy, right? You know, why can't we all be like my cat, who's so cool? I think we've, I come from the South Asian community, and we are really quite terrible in relation to our racism against Black people. My mum is from East Africa. And I remember asking her when I was a kid, why do you hate Black people so much? And she was like, but you know, they're lower than us, right? And just completely serious. And And those kinds of messages have been very common in the Asian community, not necessarily with my generation, right? But around the more traditional community and around the older generation. And they've never really been challenged. Yeah. So more recently, I've seen a number of groups springing up, wanting to talk to the elders, wanting to do this, wanting to do that. And so what happens for me is, and it's not just that, it's like everything we've seen, right? Newspapers, media, advertising, you know, books, television, teachers, everything has centralized whiteness and marginalized color, particularly blackness, right, which is at the end of that scale, right? And so we've all been conditioned and we're all in this soup. And so when I go out, I notice myself, right, I hear some noise behind me, and there'll be 3 young black boys, and I'll sort of grab my bag automatically, right? And then I'll just look again, and I'm like, these are kids, right? They're 16 years old, they're just chatting and laughing, and they're going down the street, right? So I kind of have to try and recreate those patterns and let my bag go and smile sweetly, and they kind of look at me weirdly, right? And I notice myself listening to somebody who has an accent, right? So I go into court and there'll be another barrister and he might have an accent, right? And particularly if he's African, I notice myself kind of zone out, and I'm like, oh, what are you doing? And I have to really listen. Yeah, so I know, but what happens is I notice it very quickly now. Whereas before it used to be hard to notice, but the more that happens, I notice it and change it, notice it and change it, notice it and change it. And I find myself doing it less and less. But that's why, given, you know, I am who I am, and I've always stood, I know you want everyone to see you, right? She wants everyone to see her, make a fuss. I'm one of those lesbians that has a cat who they adore, right? So, I kind of notice it more and more, and I feel it's shifting, but I don't think it's easy. Yeah, and I'm somebody who's representing asylum seekers 20 years, being involved in anti-racism work forever, is a hardcore political activist, right? And it catches me, right? I'm in the soup as well.
I love that, Raggy. Absolutely love that. And I think I really wanted to touch upon, I guess, like the global aspect of this. You know, I think most of us on here are probably based in the US, but, you know, really thinking about this from a global perspective is really important, because nothing is, you know, siloed like in the United States or even in the Western, you know, hemisphere. But 2 things I wanted to bring up is, you know, like growing up for me, you know, I grew up in a West Indian household, and within my household, I was taught that other Black people, you know, like Raggy said, right, were like lower than us, right? And so I was taught, you know, like Haitians, Jamaicans, and specifically Black Americans, right, that those 3 groups were lower than us, right? And that we should look down upon them, right? And so I carried those sentiments like with me, you know, and they really do get ingrained in you, especially when this happens as a child. And that's why I put in the chat that, you know, the anti-racism work like starts at home, you know, because a lot of these things that I learned before I ever hit a classroom, before a teacher ever opened a whitewashed history book, you know. So that's one point that I wanted to make. And then also too, I traveled to South Korea a couple years ago, and I think that being in South Korea like really showed me how much of like, I guess like a novelty or like a commodity Black people seem to be in other countries. You know, we would go and travel places, you know, around South Korea and Seoul, and it was like a lot of them were like Chinese tourists specifically, would want to come up and like take pictures with us, you know. And I think part of it, you know, definitely could do with the fact that there aren't a lot, they live in a more homogenous like country. But nonetheless, it made me feel very like commoditized, and like, you know, just people like, oh my God, like, you know, your hair, your skin, like that. Those are the 2 things that I wanted to just kind of touch upon. But I think, again, just going back to the fact that anti-Blackness, you know, it starts young, it starts at home. And, you know, no matter how old you are, like, you know, the participants on this call right now, it's never too late to reprogram, right? Like, I know the older generations, like my grandmother, and, you know, they learned it as well, you know, and so I don't necessarily like hold that against them, because they too were products of the systems that oppressed them, right? And they too were taught, you know, anti-Black ways of living, honestly, and ways of survival that eventually ended up being, you know, really detrimental in the long run. So I guess that's why we're here, right? Is to like end a lot of these cycles, for sure.
And I want to bring Nancy as soon as she comes back again. I want to make sure that she has a chance. But while we just listened to Crystal, and before that we listened to Raggy. And I just want to put some lines underneath and some stars next to what they're saying, because what they're describing, listen to what Raggy said, listen to what Crystal said. They're describing a process for how you start to eliminate this inside of you. What Raggy said was she noticed it. And every time she noticed it, it got a little less and less and less. This is not complicated. It's not a hard thing to do. We'll talk about it. Raggy, maybe we can talk about this at the end, what the process is.
Yeah, I want to say a little bit more.
You can absolutely do it. But what it means is you have to commit. You have to decide that you're going to notice, and you're not going to just dump it back in. You're gonna see it, and then you're gonna breathe into it. You're gonna release it every single time, and it will go away. Nancy, could you come back in and tell us about how anti-Black racism manifests itself inside of you?
I grew up with lots and lots of messages about how people of color, especially people from Africa, were not even really human beings. And I found that offensive because my father also thought women were not human beings. So I've identified with fighting against internalized superiority and anti-Black racism my whole life. I fought against it mostly by making friends with as many people of color as I could from the time I could. And that I've broken down over the years, a lot of my prejudices, but I'm just so aware that from the time I was little, I was presumed to be in a group that had the right to make these stereotypes, to call people and put them into categories. And that's what's hard to get rid of, that internalized sense of somehow I should have the right to say how society is or what cultures are better or worse. It's an inhaled sense of power that's invisible. I mean, why should a little girl feel like she has this power? So it's so unconscious in some ways, and I've been horrified to find out how much racism is still inside of me. I'm ashamed. I've been working my whole life to eradicate it. So I actually don't completely agree with you, Diane, that it's so simple. I just think it takes a commitment, and I want a different world. I want a different view of the world. I want a world in which all cultures, you know, Ibram Kendi talks about cultural racism, not just color, but thinking some cultures have more value to the human race than other cultures. And if we look in our hearts, most of us do have biases about this. I mean, I know most of my friends who are white think Italy has more to offer than Samoa, but how many of us think that too? And so I'm just continually trying to peel off the onion skins of my own racism and anti-Black racism.
The anti-Black racism. Thank you, Nancy. And let me just be clear. It's a simple process, but you have to decide. And if you're raised in a white supremacist society and you're in it, for me, I was never raised as a white supremacist. So the more you have to do, but the process is the same. You have to notice it every single time. And so, Jordana, as a white Jewish woman, Canadian, how does this anti-Blackness arise in you? Or how did it arise? Or what's going on with the anti-Blackness in you? You're can't hear you.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Better? Okay. I would just want to say that Raggy and Nancy were very courageous. It's very hard to admit to those things. And I have to say, given the fact that I've been fighting against this myself for more than 4 decades, my heart is still beating strongly in my chest every time I facilitate, I talk about, I'm in a situation, and it'll never, I don't know if that will ever go away. I'm not saying that's a sign of anti-Blackness, but it's a tension inside my body as a white Jewish person. I also wanted to say, I just wanted to bring up something interesting. When we put this panel together, there was a debate of whether I could manifest both a white person and a Jewish person. And I found that interesting. It ended up that we needed a Jewish person and a white person, which would be Nancy. And again, it just goes around this whole issue of who's white presenting. I'm coming from a point where Jewish people are entirely white and white presenting. They benefit from the privileges. I benefit from the privileges. In terms of anti-Blackness, what I can say is, given my life history, which some people on this call know very well on this Zoom call, one of the issues I have is this idea of white saviorism. So I go back to the examples I brought up before, and I've been in many of those my whole life, where I'm with Black female friends, Black friends, African-American friends, whether it's Boston, Miami, in the DC area. And constantly, as a white person in that circle, I see what's happening. So when I hear other white people say, you know, people are overreacting and so forth, you know, I know that that's not true, and I've seen it. My issue is, how do I deal with those? Again, if you are there as a white person and use your privilege, you might be doing the right thing. You also might be acting the white savior. And it goes back to intent versus impact. What is my intent? And ultimately, what's the impact on the people I'm with and the people who are disrespecting and treating the people I'm with in a certain way where they're not treating me that way? And so that's what I grapple with, especially now with everything going on, is what is the role of a white person in that circumstance? And again, I mean, this sounds odd, even though it's been 40 years, it's been 40 years of my personal life with my personal circle of friends who happen to be mostly Black people. So in terms of activism, this is relatively new in a public sphere. And so I'm learning how to do that. And these questions are coming to me now, and I'm grappling with them as well.
So I just got a 10-minute warning, and so we're going to end on time so that the small group can have its full hour. And so there are 7 of us. I'd like to bring Pharaoh in because he's a male, he's Black, and he's an African American. So I think that perspective is important. So if we could just, each one of you, 1 minute, what's the most important thing you can say to your own anti-Blackness? So what is it about your own anti-Blackness, whatever you want to say? Let's start with Mina because she started us.
1 minute. Well, I actually wanted to, maybe I can do this as my wrap up, but I wanted to respond to what Raggy said in terms of like catching myself in the soup, and what Tina and also Crystal were saying about perpetuating these systems of anti-Blackness. And for me, like, I remember when I used to get really annoyed and frustrated and sometimes angry at this Black-white binary without really realizing that, you know, it is a hierarchy of racial superiority that myself as an Asian, I'm contributing to. And so, like, I'm thinking about, you know, in terms of my anti-Blackness and how it's been coming up for me, like, one of the police officers involved in the George Floyd murder was Hmong, and he's sorry, his name is Tu Tao, I think. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And I remember my first instinct to that news coming out was how, oh, well, he's Southeast Asian. I don't know if I identify with Southeast Asians. And, you know, of course, like the Asian American coalition is a pan-ethnic coalition. And so, of course, like I have to own it and I have to speak up against it, right? Same thing with, you know, the LA riots. There was a Korean grocery store owner, this was in '92, although this happened in '91, I think. But there was a Korean grocery store owner who shot and killed a 15-year-old African-American girl who came in because the owner thought that the girl was stealing orange juice. And I remember when I like first came, and the girl's name was Latasha Harlins, I forget if I said that. But I remember when I first heard of the story, my immediate thought was, well, you know, no one was going to support the Korean immigrant communities that were there. And they were left to fend for themselves. But then as I have shifted my framing of and sort of understanding of, you know, sort of where Korean Americans fit into this Black and white binary, is that there are all sorts of ways that we have internalized white supremacy and how that shows up in the press coverage among Korean American media about these types of incidents, and how it really is, you know, how it really is up to myself, but then also, you know, folks in my networks and also just like the Korean American community to kind of own up to that internalized whiteness that we have, as well as the anti-Blackness. So just wanted to share that. And I think it's always like I said before, it's always raising your awareness through dialogue, such as, you know, the one we're having right now, but then also educating yourself so that you have, you know, a multidimensional perspective on what actually happens, what actually happened in history and what's happening in the present.
Thank you, Mina. Now we're really pressed. I see Crystal is really looking. And so let me call on Crystal. She's really engaged.
Sure. Can you reframe the question one more time for me, Diane, please?
Yeah, just to wrap it up, on your own anti-Blackness, what's the most important thing that for you that you feel or do, or what?
Mm-hmm.
What's the biggest thing in anti-Blackness?
Yeah. So for me, I think it's holding space for myself to understand that these systems didn't start with me. I didn't cause anti-Blackness, right? Like nobody here, you know, caused racism and anti-Blackness, right? But we did perpetuate it. We did continue the cycles. And so I think for me, I hold space in recognizing that. And also I try to be patient with myself, I think, as well, in terms of this process. It's frustrating when you get to realize the ways in which you've been perpetuating cycles. And I know I can be really hard on myself. So I think that's part of it, is like, you know, giving myself space to say, okay, like I got it wrong this time, you know, how can I do it better next time? And just, you know, creating that space for myself personally, like in my day-to-day life, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The audience, the participants would like to hear from Farrell on this question.
Sure.
How does anti-Blackness manifest itself in you? And what do you think about that?
I would say that I would personally believe that I wasn't raised in much of a framework of white supremacy, but even still, there are lots of subversive ways that even, you know, unintentionally, lots of things can slip in. I would say personally, spiritually, I had mentioned that earlier. I had something that I think about a lot as of recently, since I've been, I'd say since late teenage into, you know, currently as a younger adult. That's been like a major part of how I think about the relationship with anti-Blackness and the concept of spiritual domination of, you know, the large faiths, which are not even native to Europe, but, you know, native to the Middle East, and then branched out from there into spreading around.
And Farrell, could you?
My ancestry in that sense.
speak directly to how it manifests in you. What are your
Yeah, that's what I mean. So, because I was raised, I wasn't raised with those things, and those things were barely taught to me, and those are largely things that I've thought about, is like how I feel like being raised in those senses and, you know, thinking of those things as other rather than as a part of me is an aspect of that. I would also say that even though it wasn't something that I gained from my family personally, through, you know, acquaintances and through friends, a lot of the aspects of, you know, like even within the Black race, like concept of, you know, competition between ethnicity, not even ethnicity, that's a lie, nationalities of Black people are something that I heard externally. And I would say when I was younger, that might have been something I thought about, like something that Crystal had mentioned, you know, especially from Caribbeans, you know, Caribbean Americans, you know, thinking of, or Afro-Caribbean, so I'm trying to say, thinking of, you know, each other as above or below one another and things like that. But something that my grandfather had told me when I was fairly young, my father's father, was that the only difference between a Jamaican, a Barbadian, a Haitian, a Dominican, an African American is if their slave master was American, British, French, or Spanish, and that's it. Because besides that, we are literally the same ethnicities. That's why I had to correct myself. We're mostly from, you know, different West African ethnicities, but Jamaican, Barbadian, African American, those aren't ethnicities. Those are cultures and nationalities.
Yeah, thank you, Farrell. The ship, it depends on where the ship went. Because these ships left from Africa and they spread us around, but we're still coming from the same African continent. So anybody want to wrap up this whole thing? It's time for us to be done.
I'll just say one thing if I can, right? You know, show up, do the work, right? It's not just about reading books, right? It's about doing your personal work, looking at where these things show up in you. You know, take the plunge, right? Have some guts, show up, take accountability, take responsibility, stand with us, stop fucking sitting on your butt, right? The world is in disarray. We need to be together and to step up.
Thank you. Thank you, Reggie. And let me just remember us back to the part where we started in the introduction. Look with what you can do yourself. Look at your networks. I can't say how important that is. Share your network. Support Black people, not just these big organizations. Support the small organizations. Support your Patreon Black people. Support there's lots of ways. Go to LinkedIn, find the Black people, share your networks. Okay, thank you. Heather, okay, now what are we gonna do, Heather? Are we gonna just fly into our breakout rooms?
Yeah, so I think if people want to, you can turn your videos on if you'd like, and then we're gonna be breaking you into your breakout rooms. And so we're gonna be in those rooms for about an hour until 12:35, and that is gonna be our lunch break time. So I believe Adam has all the breakout rooms set up.
Yeah. And your facilitator will introduce themselves to you. There are some facilitators that were not on this panel. So, I mean, there's Lane and there's other people that are on the panel. Shout out to Asia Hardison. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So I guess Adam, take us away.